All right, guys. So we're gonna Rome's gonna be divided into several parts. So right now we're gonna start with part one. As I have been doing, I want to try and kind of ground you to the relationships geographically of the development of the civilizations, particularly Western civilizations. So I've been trying to use the same sort of context maps that we started with. This is the Dymaxion globe that you guys initially built. And part of what I wanted you guys to take a look at, something seems to be wrong here. Ah, there it is the relationship of each of the civilizations that we've studied so far. So, and again, the bodies of water and the land masses. So we started with Mesopotamia, then we went to Egypt, then we went to Greece, and now we're over in Rome. Okay, and you can see that there's this very close proximity. Something we haven't talked about that we will talk about, we'll talk about briefly at the very sort of beginning lectures, was that civilizations, Western civilizations started in this general area, but there were other civilizations that were sort of occurring in the Indus Valley and in the Yellow River valleys. So if you remember way back to the very first lecture when we talked about prehistoric cultures, that's what we had. You can see the proximity of things and the overlap of things, and you can see the relationship of these different cultures to the Mediterranean Sea. One of the things that's interesting about this turning point in kind of the development of architecture in cities is that up until now, cultures sort of influenced each other, right? So we know that the Greeks visited both Mesopotamia and Egypt. We know that the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians had some level of contact with each other, all right? Rome begins a different sort of approach to the development of culture and civilization. And so one of the things that's interesting to look at Rome from its early stages on the Italian peninsula to Rome when it reaches its peak around 100 to 117 AD or ACE. So you can see that by the time it reaches its peak, it's pretty much taken over most of Europe, North Africa, and a portion of Asia. Okay, and one of the things about the Romans is that they absorbed cultures into their culture, predominantly Greek and Etruscan cultures. Let's take a little bit closer look at sort of some of the geography. All right, so here we see another image that I have been updating sort of slowly throughout each of the presentations. So once again, now in relationship to the European continent, the Asian continent, and the African continent, we see each of the civilizations we've studied, the initial sort of development of Rome, and then how Rome essentially covered everything in the area of the Mediterranean and even went up into the English Isles. And I'm going to sort of couch that with, these are ellipses. This is the shape that I have to work with. I don't have an accurate sort of way of delineating exactly where the edges were, but I do have a map that I'll show you briefly that talks about that. Okay? Go in the right direction, yes. So there's a closer up view. Same exact one that we looked at before. So now we can clearly see the Nile River and the Delta. We can see the Tigris Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent coming across here. We see Greece and the Greek Isles and the Ionian sort of portion of Turkey, and then Rome. This is kind of an overall map that shows the extent of the Roman Empire around the 2nd century ACE, use the proper term, and you can see that it's pretty much moved into everything surrounding the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and all the way up to the British Isles, clear up there. So that's pretty far north. All right, so let's take a look at some timelines in the development of Rome. So Rome initially appears on the Italian peninsula, or the Italian peninsula starts to be moved into recorded history sometime around 700 before the Common Era, BCE. So at that point, the Greeks are in their full power, and they have started to colonize the lower portion of the Italian peninsula and a portion of the Sicilian island. Okay, to the north of that are this orange area are a group of people called the Etruscans. All right, so how many of you guys have heard of a portion of Italy called Tuscany? Right? Well, Tuscany is up here, and it's where the Etruscans were initially from. So we have the Greeks to the south, the Etruscans to the north, and then we have the Carthaginians, which are an empire. It was part of the Phoenician Empire that is in North Africa. And those three cultures are sort of coming together in this portion of the Mediterranean. Okay? This is an image of what's going on, let's call it right around 500 BCE. Okay? And you can see that Rome is a city-state in the middle of the Italian peninsula along the coast. And at that point, the Greeks were influencing how people sort of viewed governance, right? The idea of a city-state, right, becoming kind of its own entity that would have relationship with other city-states was the key thing. So 500 BCE. Now we go to 200 BCE, and you can see that Rome has now pretty much conquered all of the Italian peninsula, the three major islands off of the coast to the west, and it's pretty much kicked Greece completely out of the picture, and it's removed Carthage from the equation. Right? By 30 BCE, the Roman Empire has now spread through the use of alliances all the way up into portions of Europe. And actually, this map is very limited in its context. You start to see, as we move into 100 to 200 AD, that it's literally moved up, clear up into the European continent, over into Asia, and down into Africa across the way. The next map here shows you kind of the extent of the Roman Empire at its height, and you can see that it's the empire and its influences essentially covered all of the developed known world at that time to them. This doesn't include what's going on in Asia, and also sort of precludes things that might have been happening a little further south into the Arabian Peninsula. Okay? So hopefully that gives you kind of a picture of how sort of Rome developed over that time period. All right? So some things that I wanted to kind of bring to your attention is this whole idea that the Romans essentially absorbed other civilizations. Okay? The Etruscans were one group of people that we just mentioned to you. They were to the north. We had the Greeks. They were, in the Greek mainland, but also the Greek Isles and in the southern portion of Italy. The Greeks had a relationship with the Etruscans. They started to influence the Etruscans. Okay? And that developed to a point where Rome became a city-state, and then as it progressed on, Rome was essentially influenced by the Etruscan-Greek relationship. Okay? One of the things that's interesting that I don't have written up here, but you guys should sort of be aware of this, is that Rome systematically went through and destroyed the Etruscan culture, but absorbed components of their sort of architecture and culture, but they preserved the Greek architecture and the Greek culture. So in some ways, the Romans considered the Greeks to be their superiors in regards to culture, literature, architecture, and as such, they just absorbed it. Here is a map showing sort of the development of Rome in relationship to the Etruscan, right? And what we're looking at right now is the Etruscan influence on the sort of Roman culture, okay? So one of the things about the Etruscans is that they were a culture that was heavily into pleasure, okay? They didn't seem to take this long view of history, at least not in stuff that we found. They didn't seem to record it substantially. They were very much about living in the moment. And the art that's left, the pottery that's left, and some of the sort of tombs that are left kind of talk about their sort of lives from that perspective. One of the things that was interesting about the Etruscans is that at this time period, there was a sense of equality, not complete equality, but a sense of equality between the genders, which is very, very unusual. All right? So very little remains of the Etruscan architecture because the Romans systematically went through and destroyed it all. Okay? So what we have is mostly sculpture or forms of models that were actually inside of their tombs. So the tombs were not destroyed, but the buildings themselves were. So you can take a look at the sort of composition of this sort of temple, and you can see the relationship to the Greeks, right? So that's one of the key things is that we have a lot of the elements of Greek architecture sort of represented in these sort of temples and structures that we have inside of Tuscany or inside of the Etruscan culture. One of the things that's interesting about them that's different than the Greeks is that they viewed their buildings kind of as a frontal facade, sort of in the same way that the Egyptians sort of looked at things in the sort of frontal fashion. Whereas the Greeks would position their buildings at these unusual angles so that they were perceived as a three-dimensional object, the Etruscans thought of it more as what you see from a straight-on perspective. In many cases, this is an example of a model of a Greek, or not a Greek, but a Etruscan temple. The sides of the buildings essentially were either embedded within other buildings or were treated in a very sort of simplistic manner, and only the front of it was articulated in such a way that that it had a significant level of detail. Okay. Going back to some of the Greek terms, the whole idea of all of those different sort of naming sort of conventions for the Greek temples, the idea of the peripteral set of columns versus the prostyle set of columns. The peripteral being columns that were freed of walls, and the prostyle being ones that were engaged either into the walls or between walls. The Etruscans essentially had columns just up in the front of the building, and they were freed from the walls that were behind them. One of the things that the Etruscans did take specifically from the Greeks was this Tuscan order. It was a simplified order based on the Doric order, had similar proportions, but all of the pieces of it were much simpler and less ornate, less sort of articulated. Okay, so we have this Etruscan culture that occurred to the north of Rome, being one of the influencing components of Rome. Okay, and you'll start to see that these different elements are going to be incorporated into their architecture. We can't forget Rome's debt to Greece. All right, so they took the three orders of Greek architecture. They took the Tuscan order, and then they built a fifth order called the composite order, which we'll take a look at in a different lecture. And that became, right, the basis of a lot of the stylistic component of Roman architecture. Okay? Time? All right.